Now let's talk about hacking web apps themselves. So we have some goals in hacking web applications: that you can understand concepts of web apps and threats related to web apps, and web app hacking methodology, and the tools and the countermeasures, and some of the security tools, not only for the attacking but the defense, and understand web app penetration testing. So these are the modules we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about web application concepts, vulnerabilities and exploits, threats, injection attacks, hidden fields and clickjacking. We'll talk about cross-site attacks again, additional web app attacks, hacking methodology, hacking countermeasures, security tools, and web app pen testing, starting with just concepts. So you've got a web server. It's a service. It listens on port 80 and 443, and it probably does multiple things. It will have different little executables. Now, they can be scripts, that's very typical, or they can be full-on executables that do different interactive things with the user. Those little things that interact with the user are web applications, web apps. They run on the web server. So there will be a web app to log you in, a web app to take your order, a web app to check the status of your order. It kind of depends upon how it's designed, but all these little functionalities are handled by various web apps. And you might even have a web server that has multiple web sites. So you can have like a www.example.com/sales, and that is one website that is on that server. And then /marketing, which is a whole other website. And they can have links to each other or not. And then you can have another one for like customers and another one for whatever. And each one of these websites can have little web apps. So the web apps are the things, typically scripts, but they don't have to be. They can be full-on executables that interact with users so that browser content is no longer just a static HTML page. We can interact with it. We can put things in a shopping cart. We can review stuff. We can check the status of an order. We can search for things. We can search for similar things. We can compare 3 similar products. This is what web apps do. So how do web apps work? They create an interface between the web server and the end user using web pages. Web apps are executable, typically scripts, but they don't have to be, and as such they are vulnerable to attack, even if you have some security policies in place, because the web app itself could be poorly written. We are using Web 2.0 technologies, which unfortunately make it easier to exploit web apps. The reason why we have web apps is for business functionality. So for example, here's just a regular user with a browser-based form, like log in or fill in your credit card information or whatever this form is. They're going across the internet, they're going through the external firewall to the web server, which is in a DMZ. At least we hope it is. The web server has web apps running on the web service. The web apps are going to talk to a database to keep track of what the user is doing, including their orders and the status of their orders. The web apps potentially could talk to the underlying operating system. Now, all these things here are actually running on this box, okay? A web app could potentially talk to an operating system. Now, that's not very good. We don't want that. Instead, we want the web app to talk to the database and then talk back to the user. But it might be possible to get a web app to talk to the operating system, bad, and thus we, the hacker, are talking to it. And we, the hacker, are then feeding this browser something illicit. So that's sort of like a typical web app scenario. We are in the middle of using Web 2.0, and it has an application architecture. And that architecture has, of course, clients, which is users in their browsers, or mobile devices, mobile apps. It has web servers, And then it has what we call an application layer and a database layer. If we go back here, the database layer is typically a database on a separate database server, and actually there should be a firewall right here, an internal firewall. And then you'll have web apps that will implement some kind of business functionality, business logic, business policy. And that's considered sort of a conceptual layer. So when we look here, we have the database, we have the business functionality, we have the web server itself, and then we have the users and their devices and browsers. A web app is a whole sort of infrastructure for dynamic participation of the user. It can include active content, social interaction, collaboration. So when I said that this thing is taking your order, it could also include like buttons and reviews and share with somebody, and or it might not even be an online an online shopping site. It could instead be an online collaboration site so that we can all work together on something. Or it could be a server where we are all like Skyping together or doing some sort of online web conference. So you have all sorts of, whatever your active, interactive content is, that is something that is done by a web app. Now, of course, it introduces new technologies which are exploitable. You can see here that there are many moving parts. Let me just zoom in here. Many moving parts. I could have email, news, weather, banking, RSS feeds, documents, all coming in and out of the internet to our web server, which has maybe like a user authentication module going to a directory service and a database. And then we've got a client over here with a browser, and that browser is running JavaScript, HTML, Ajax, Flash, something like that. And it's getting these pages from the web server, and it is doing something with those pages. And maybe even we have something else on the side, like a blog. So you can see a lot of moving parts with regard to a web app. And every one of these things is a potential for hacking. So here's a web app example. Here's the user, they log in. They go across the internet, they go through the firewall, they go to the web server. Like I said, they go to the web app, which talks to a database, which might make operating system calls to like grab files. And then hopefully it's actually, we're running legitimate database queries like select everything from the news table where the ID is something. So give me, based on this ID, all the news that is relevant to me. And I get some output. And so maybe the ID is some number, the topic is technology, and the source is, say, CNN or some other kind of site. So this would be an example of a web app running. Web apps have all sorts of programming languages that they use, including PHP, Java 2E, Java, Python, Ruby, ASP.NET, C#, VB.NET, Classic ASP, JavaScript. So, and there can be even more than this, but these are just some common web app programming languages. And so you can see that there's stuff running on the server side. We'll have services and we'll have APIs. An API is just basically a functionality button, as it were. Push that API and the service will do something specific for you. It will use various protocols, not necessarily like OSI protocols like IP or TCP, although there's that too, but also protocols for just establishing sessions and maintaining sessions and sending HTTP commands back and forth. And then it'll be structured in certain ways. And then your browser runs all these different technologies. Not that you are expected to be a programmer and know all this, but you are expected to understand and respect the fact that all this exists and all of these have potential issues. So Web 2.0 applications, they are user-centered, They are aimed at interactive data sharing and collaboration and interoperability. That's the key. And that's why we need the web apps, and that is why they are potentially risky. So that is just a quick overview of web apps.